Welcome everyone to the Department Number 2 podcast brought to you by the Western Theater in the Civil War. My name is Derrick Lindo, and I'm joined as usual here with my partner in crime, Darryl Smith. And tonight we are going to be speaking with Mr. Stuart Sanders, the world-renowned author and historian. And if you don't have his books, you should definitely get them. But that's something that we're going to be talking a lot about tonight. So, but before we get into everything, we kind of started a new little thing, I guess tradition here at the very beginning. We want to tell you, go to our website. We decided that'd probably be a good thing to do. So go to westerntheatercivilwar.com and check that out. We've got nearly 300 blog posts. You can find the links for the other shows, for our YouTube page. And if you feel so inclined to support us a little bit, there's a place you can do that too. It's there's a link that says buy us a coffee. Click that and then just go from there. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. So, Darryl, will you introduce our guest for us, please?
Yeah, sure will. Let's see. I think tonight too, he's going to focus on Sasquatch at Bill Springs. I'm sorry.
That's right.
We have to do it. I think the very first time I heard Stuart speak, he'd come up to the Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable, and he was speaking about his aftermath of a Perryville book. And I think we were all enthralled and enamored with his delivery, but also the story he told. And from that point, I've had the opportunity. Actually, that's not true. That's not the first time I met Stuart. I met Stuart like in 1993 when he was down heading up the local Perryville Preservation Organization. And I happened to wander upstairs into his office, and I thought I'd be there all of 5 minutes. I think 2 hours later, we finally wrapped up chatting, and then I went to the battlefield and walked on it. At that point, it was about 300-ish acres were opened up, probably 6 or 7 miles of hiking trails. So that was the very first time. But then I've heard Stuart speak. He's supported our efforts here at the Western Theater and the Civil War group. He's written some blog posts for us. He's obviously he is I don't know, world renowned, but he's at least Western Theater's Department 2 renowned author and speaker on the tour circuit. So without further ado, I'd like to say welcome and good evening, Stuart. We're really glad to have you on tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's all downhill from here after that kind introduction. So
yeah, well, just like what we
invoices in the mail, by the way.
That's right.
And what we were talking about the other day, I'm expecting a lot of cursing.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I'm going to liberally use that bleep sound effect. So got that thing ready to go.
My kind of podcast, then.
There you go. It's not family friendly from here on out.
That's
but
right. Bleep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, let's jump in. Let's talk about the very first book, and I can't remember if it's the Mill Springs book or it's the Perryville Under Fire book. Is the first book.
The first one published was Perryville Under Fire, and it's about the aftermath of the Battle of Perryville, as the title indicates, and that came out, I think it was about 2012, I believe, and that actually came about after I'd given a talk about sort of the tactics of the battle and almost put a few people to sleep, boring them to tears, and I thought I really need to come up with something that's a little more human interest friendly. And I'd worked, as you mentioned, Darryl, in your kind introduction, I'd worked with the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association doing historic preservation, battlefield preservation, and interpretation there. And my office was right in downtown Perryville, and we worked with these 1840s commercial buildings along Merchants Row and all these antebellum houses. And the story is that all these buildings were used as hospitals, and so that just really intrigued me. So I thought, well, maybe in order to give a better speech, I'll sort of write a speech about how the battle affected local civilians. And so after I'd given that, after a while, I realized, hey, this would make a compelling book. And so that's how that project got started.
And I will echo that. I know several people probably listening to the podcast have read your book. It tells an incredible story about the impact, of course, in the region. And it's not just, the casualties in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, but how long these casualties are lingering in the area, as well as the impact economically on the region. And so you can take the Perryville Under Fire book and really apply it to any Civil War battle. but it really hits home. And one thing that I just never forget is the discussion about pork prices, for example.
Yeah.
You want to give us a little insight to what I'm alluding to there?
Yeah, I can ruin everyone's dinner tonight with this. And one time I gave a talk after a meal at a Civil War roundtable, and they'd had pork, so that was sort of a hard one to do. But there were 7,500 casualties. Men killed and wounded after the Battle of Perryville, and this is in about 4 or 5 hours time, as we know. So the battle was marked as being one of the most intense of the Civil War by veterans. Who commented on how the fighting never seemed to stop during that 4 or 5 hour period. And after the battle, the Confederate Army departed. They left and left most of their, dead and wounded on the field, essentially. And the Union Army ended up burying their own dead in regimental plots, essentially where the men had fallen. But they left the Confederate bodies lying out on the field, and there were bodies on the field for days and days and days after the battle. And unfortunately, local hogs that were roaming around the battlefield were rooting up bodies, were consuming them. Soldiers tried to place fence rails around piles of bodies to protect them. It didn't work very well. And, when you read the firsthand accounts of soldiers who toured the battlefield after the fight, it's nearly universal. I'd say that, one of the main things they comment about are the number of hogs that were rooting up bodies. And it was said that for months after the battle, that no one would buy pork from Boyle County. And because of that, it caused hog prices to basically plummet. So just, it's an interesting way how, a Civil War battle can affect a regional economy in that regard. And but that story's also always sort of stuck with me as well, unfortunately, as part of the battle. But, it's just part of the grim reality of what happened when, you have tens and tens of thousands of soldiers clashing in a small town of 300 inhabitants at the time. Every home, barn, shed, church, school, business became field hospitals after the fight. There were few doctors, little water. One Union surgeon said he couldn't wash the blood off his hands for 2 days. And so, you can imagine these surgeons who have unclean hands, unclean instruments, and they're going from, wounded man to wounded man, just spreading disease. And so post-battle casualties were terrible. And, it was something that lingered in the community for just, months as you had all these buildings converted into field hospitals.
Yeah. And Derek and I sometimes talk about what we call like must-read type books. And we're going to try to get your head not to balloon up and fill the whole screen that we're looking at here. But again, because of the fact that you can take the story of Perryville and really, truly apply it across any larger battle, I think it's a must-read book.
No, thanks.
There's not a lot of books that focus on aftermath, unless it's like The Retreat, Gettysburg or that sort of thing, right? You don't really see a lot written specifically on that. It's a fantastic book. And I think
thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's right up there with some of those classics that Derek and I have spoken about that folks need to really read to understand what's going on aftermath of the battlefield. And of course, it applies to Department Up to Territory as well.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, most battle histories, as we know, they'll do a chapter on the aftermath. And I think there's so many deeper moving stories that can be told by really investigating, again, the days, weeks, and months after a battle took place. And as you mentioned earlier, Darryl, it didn't affect only Perryville. Towns for miles and miles and miles around, from Bardstown, Lebanon, Danville, Harrodsburg. I mean, all these places were affected. And then, one blog post I wrote for the Western Theater blog, actually talks about how Louisville was affected by the battle. And, one interesting thing I found while researching that, and I didn't find this for the book, I found it working on that blog post, is that John Wilkes Booth had been performing in Louisville around the time of the Battle of Perryville. So even John Wilkes Booth would have potentially seen sort of the horrors of the aftermath as Union soldiers were transported to Louisville, where there were dozens and dozens, because sort of, the more lightly wounded and the sick who could travel ended up making their way up to Louisville. And, New Albany, Indiana, across the Ohio River also had wounded and sick soldiers. And, illness is such a thing. I mean, there was a terrible drought in Kentucky at the time. It hadn't rained seemingly for weeks and weeks. Most creeks and streams were dry. The Chaplain River in Perryville was dry. There were only a few springs that really worked. And as I mentioned before, that lack of water led to problems with the surgeons, but also, these men were forced to drink out of these stagnant ponds of water, and caught dysentery and typhoid and all these waterborne illnesses that caused tremendous casualties. I mean, an example I use a lot is Colonel Curran Pope, who was commander of the 15th Kentucky Union Infantry Regiment, who was wounded in what he called the fleshy part of his arm during the battle, and ended up sort of going with the Union Army as far as Crab Orchard, Kentucky. Then became terribly ill, returned to Danville, where he stayed at a relative's house, and he died there of essentially typhoid. And so you have men who survived this terrible battle who then ended up catching illnesses along the way and passing away. So
it's a great add on there about the disease too. So it's a very impactful book. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Before we jump into your next book, tell us a little bit about you, what you're currently doing, that sort of thing. Get our readers a little more, whet their appetite a little bit, so they'll rush over to Amazon and start buying some books.
Yeah, sure. So I actually grew up in Lexington, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, and as many of your listeners will know, it's the burial site of both Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. It's where Washington Lee University is and the Virginia Military Institute. I actually grew up 2 doors down from the house where Stonewall Jackson lay in state when they returned his remains to Lexington. And across the street from that house is the home of William Nelson Pendleton, who was Lee's chief of artillery. And so I was sort of surrounded, literally as a child growing up, was surrounded by the war. At the time, I need to note as sort of a footnote that the house where Jackson lay in state was a fraternity house when I was a kid. So it had a different atmosphere in the 1980s as opposed to the 1860s. But in high school, I ended up working at the Lee Chapel, which is the site where Robert E. Lee's buried. And this was right when Ken Burns' Civil War series sort of came out. So, the early 90s. And so there was this big upswing in interest about Civil War history. And I swore I was not going to become a Civil War person, but I was bitten by the bug. And, you can take the boy out of Lexington, Virginia, but you can't take the Lexington, Virginia out of the boy in a sense. And I ended up coming to Kentucky for school, attended Center College, where I've had a lot of family go. And just, in reading about the war in the West, became really intrigued by it. I mean, I just ended up sort of immersed in Lee and Jackson and the stories of the war in Virginia, but, started reading more about the Western theater and also, the Trans-Mississippi in particular, and Quantrell's Rangers and Bloody Bill Anderson, and never heard any of these stories, growing up in Virginia, and just got hooked and started freelance magazine writing for Civil War magazines in college, published my first piece with America's Civil War, right out of school, which I wrote on Kentucky Confederate General Highland B. Lyon, who raided a lot of Kentucky courthouses in 1864. And, those sort of interesting stories about Kentucky and just kind of the craziness of these bluegrass state characters really just got me hooked. And I was fortunate enough after graduating from Center to start working for the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association, as I mentioned, and eventually became executive director of that and worked there for 10 years, preserving and interpreting that battleground. And just, really, met so many wonderful people and just had so many great experiences. It was just a great place to sort of start my public history career and historic preservation too. And did that for 10 years. And for the last 20, I've worked for the Kentucky Historical Society in a variety of roles. And now I'm director of research and publications there, but I've worked in every corner of that building. So I've always sort of had a hand in Civil War stuff, and have written, continued to write magazine articles and other things, and have done the 5 books as well. So it's been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Derrick, you want to jump in there, or I'm ready to move to my next favorite book by him?
Yeah. So I was actually, for talking about Perryville Under Fire, I just want to say that I love using those stories in my 8th grade class.
Oh, cool.
Just because, number one, I just like grossing them out. The second reason is just because it really helps them understand how, local some of these things can be. I mean, Perryville's not too far away from us. I mean, 2.5 hours or so.
Yeah.
But a lot of these places they're familiar with, some of these other towns around the area, because then they travel and everything. And, but just how, they hear about the battles, they read about the battles, they write notes on them and stuff. But that's when they really understand, just because the armies march away doesn't mean the suffering stops. And so I just love throwing those things into them, because I'll even use some of those as examples, even when we're talking about the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, wherever big battles are fought, these sorts of things are going to happen. And so I love throwing that stuff in. And so I got your book on my desk whenever that time comes around there. So
Yeah, one of the it's sort of an aside. One of the fun parts about writing that is there have been a few times I've given talks, and then people have come up afterwards and they said, "Hey, my ancestor's actually in this book." And there was one
that's cool.
story of a woman from, I think it was Maxville, Wisconsin, traveling by herself during the war, goes from Wisconsin to Perryville because she had heard that her brother had been shot in the head and survived. And she sort of, wanders into Kentucky, and the whole way people are sort of trying to get her to turn around. A woman traveling by herself in 1862, and but long story short, she makes her way to Perryville. Her brother had been found under an old tin shop, in a tin shop covered with a piece of, sounded like corrugated metal, essentially. Had been wounded in the head. A local doctor named Jefferson J. Polk, who's a bit of a nut himself, wanted to perform experimental brain surgery on him, and didn't let that happen. But the sister ended up nursing him back to health, and he ended up surviving. But he had sort of a tragic story later in life. He survived, but I think ended up dying sort of either by his own hand later or was killed and while serving as a policeman. But it was, I ended up meeting one of his grand nieces, I guess, and she sort of was able to fill in the story. So that's one great thing is you guys have probably found out about, working in the Civil War field, is that there are still so many, modern connections that you can draw upon and people who are still impacted today by the war.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think the next book that comes out, I have my chronological dating in order now, is Mill Springs.
Right.
It comes out the following year, I do believe, 2013. And this, why did you choose Mill Springs? Let's just start with that. Being that, that so immersed with Perryville,
right?
That's Mill Springs.
Well, I think when I was trying to figure out what to do next, I'd always had an interest in Mill Springs, and at that time, the only there were two books. There was the Zolly Tree that had been done. That was a big chunk of that was sort of genealogy about Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer, and there were only, I think, a handful of chapters about the battle. And then Ken Hafendorfer had written, his really detailed, large tome about the battle. So I thought, this is just a good opportunity with the publisher I was working with to sort of do a slimmer volume that hopefully can provide kind of that 30,000 foot view about the battle. But another reason I like the battle, I sort of learned this along the way, thanks to Bill Nykirk, who gave me a tour down there, is if you're new to sort of Civil War history, it's the perfect place to go to sort of experience, to learn about a battle for the first time, because it was such a compact area. You can essentially stand in one place and really, other than the retreat and the advance and all that, in terms of the fighting, you can get a really good view of what happened there in an easy, compact way. So, it was difficult to write just to, keep tracking of all the troop movements and all that. So by the time I read the Perryville book, I'd been there for a while and just had, a much better handle on it, but, had a lot of help and, just was really happy to write that one and enjoyed it. But that's sort of the short version of why I ended up picking that topic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. If folks, Hafendorfer does have books available down at Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. They were able to obtain a slew of copies. And it's a magnum opus, things like 600 pages, and it is uber detailed on a very small battle. When you really come down to numbers, it's pretty small. If someone's looking for a book that is well written and, I guess I'll say, unconfusing, because I like Hafendorfer's book, but sometimes some of the movements they get so redundant. You're trying to figure out, well, what's he talking about here? Stuart's book on Mill Springs is fantastic, and it's History Press, so it's readily available. It's got a good cover price on it, so it's an excellent book to pick up if you're not looking to find this massive deep dive that Kenneth Hafendorfer did. Stuart's book is a fantastic alternative to that. So
thanks.
Absolutely. I think you and I talked about this a few years back or several years back. My only beef with it is maps.
I know. I was actually going to bring that up, and
it's all about maps for us geeks.
I know,
right?
But to be honest, I was trying to write it in a way, sort of in a more narrative way. It was a little. I shouldn't say it was a little intentional. I was trying to write it in a way where hopefully you wouldn't need the maps, but I probably failed at that. But
I think you succeeded there because, like I said, I think it unraveled some things for me. Just because of your style of writing.
Thanks. Yeah.
So I think it did, but I'm just a map geek. I mean,
I get it. I totally.
You could put 300 maps in that book, and that wouldn't happen. So,
that's right.
I probably would ask for more. So
Well, but
And,
to be honest, the good thing is now you can get online and sort of
mhm,
find. And I mean, you hate to sort of put that on the reader, but at least there are maps out there that are available that you can kind of
Oh
get
yeah.
a sense of where everything is. So,
sure, absolutely.
for people who are more map geeks, or hopefully places they can find some relief when they're trying to figure out what's happening. But and the stories are so great too. Just equally interesting. I mean, you've got Kentuckians leading both sides in a sense. I mean, you've got Speed Smith Fry, the Fourth Kentucky, who became a Union general. You've got not Thomas. You got George Bibb Crittenden, leading the Confederate troops. You've got this Unionist Virginian named George Thomas, in sort of his first big victory. You've got immigrants playing a huge role in the battle with these German Ohioans in the Ninth Ohio who end up doing this massive bayonet charge across their Union right flank and sort of sweeping the rebels off the field. And so there are all these sort of heroic moments that emerge and interesting characters. And that's one thing I love about the Middle Spring story. And it's still so early in the war, being January 1862, that there's great source material out there. I was able to go to the Indiana Historical Society and pull a lot of good stuff. I had one researcher who found out I was working on the battle sent me some great stuff as well. So, I mean, had lots of help with this one too. And again, Bill Nykirk, who I mentioned, after I'd done most of the research, ended up taking me on a really detailed battle tour just so I could get a better sense of the terrain and sort of where things were happening and that kind of
mhm,
thing. So, you can never do these things, but you never do these things by yourself. There's always an
sure.
army of people behind you, helping you with everything. And but yeah, so I really enjoyed doing that book too. And but I remember doing all the research and then looking at the notes, going, "Dear God, how am I going to pull this thing together?" Because it's just battle histories are really hard to write. And but anyway, it was a fun one to do.
Yeah, it highly worth it. Again, like I said before, it's History Press, readily available, about 160 pages, if I remember correctly. So it's a good read that does flow very nicely. So again, if folks aren't looking for a 600-page magnum opus, Stuart's book is an excellent Mill Springs alternative for that. So yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna let Derek jump in here a little bit, so because I don't want to take up all the time. So
So I guess number three, that would be Manny's Brigade, right?
Yeah, that's the
Okay.
third.
Yeah, that was actually that was the first one of your books that I read
Oh, cool.
several years ago. So yeah, so let me grab
Well,
your
funny story behind that one, Derek. While you're looking for that, it's the third book I published. It was actually the first one that I'd written. Because and the story, I shouldn't admit this, but what happened was I'd been working at Perryville for a little while, not long at all, really. And I said, "Yeah, I know the battle. I've got this down pat." And so there was some governor scholars who wanted to tour the battlefield, and it was a former professor of mine was leading that class, and I took him up to Parsons Ridge on the battlefield at Perryville and got myself completely turned around. And they were asking questions I had no idea, and I was like, "This was a terrible idea," and just felt like I was drowning. And I thought I better learn this stuff, and so I started researching it. At the time, the 98 acres of the original sort of preserved battlefield was all that was accessible to the public at that time. More acreage had been preserved; it just hadn't been turned over to the state yet and made accessible. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do tours out here, I need to know what's going on. And the best way I learn things is through research. So I started that in probably, 96 or 97. I mean, I started a long time ago. And then around the same time as I was sort of working on that, Ken No was researching his great book. And so I said to myself, well, Ken's book is just going to be great. And so I, put that one on the shelf essentially. But then after I'd done the other two books, I said, why am I, here's a command study that's pretty interesting on, you had these regiments suffering 50% casualties. Ken had done an incredible overview of the battle. I mean, one of the best battle books out there, in my opinion, in terms of battle histories. And, but I thought, I think there's a little bit of room to kind of do this command study and dig more into, what did these individual units experience? And, you had a number in Manny's brigade, George Earl Manny, he was, a Mexican war vet from Nashville who ended up commanding this brigade of, 5 regiments, including, some veteran units within the Green 41st Georgia as well. And, just sort of reading into what these guys experienced on an individual basis, I thought, well, this is probably, maybe I can turn this into a book. And that's what ended up happening.
yeah. So that one, my favorite story in there though is about General Jim Jackson.
Yeah, yeah,
So can you kind of give us the story about? I mean, I know the book's about Manny's Brigade, but
yeah.
Jackson's there on the receiving end of it, and I just love
Right.
that story about what
Well,
happened.
and the book's about the brigade, but it's also equally about
Hmm.
the Union soldiers who they fought against.
Hmm.
And hopefully that comes through. But yeah, Jackson was an attorney from Hopkinsville. He'd been in Congress before the war. Had resigned to raise a regiment. Ended up raising a cavalry regiment. But he was, the typical sort of pro-slavery Kentuckian. Bit hot-headed. He sort of had a street fight in Hopkinsville before the war, and I think had almost fought a couple of other duels. So a guy like right up my alley, tied into the Southern honor stuff, and he ended up eventually was given uh, command of a division at Perryville and was up on a Parsons Ridge. And as soon as the battle started, and this is a hill on the far left flank where part of Terrell's brigade was posted, and as the battle started, he said, "Well, I'll be damned, this is getting mighty particular." And right then, he was shot twice in the chest and was killed. And so, his career at Perryville was brief, but he had a pretty interesting career in his own right in terms of or congressional politics and pre-war Kentucky. He also went to Center College, where I went, just a few years earlier, and there were some other center grads on the Confederate side who were attacking him too, which I also found interesting. As an alum of that college, so again, a lot of interesting characters who pop out of that story.
Yeah, it's 'cause I remember with the aftermath too. Jackson's body's just laying there on
Oh yeah,
that
it's
side of the
crazy.
hill there. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
he's
and
oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but his body's lying there. Confederates snip off buttons as souvenirs, and eventually two of his aides had sort of dragged him on the backside of the hill. Then they go back later, retrieve his body, and his body goes on this sort of crazy journey too. They wash it, they sort of pack him in salt. They ended up getting him to Washington County, Springfield, and there they stop at a house, and it happened to be one of his college schoolmates who sort of looked sadly at Jackson's corpse, and then they go on to Louisville, and he was eventually interred at Cave Hill Cemetery, put in a vault there, and then his body was later taken back to Hopkinsville. And I think it was in the same vault where Bull Nelson had been placed temporarily too. So yeah, it was put at Cave Hill. So he, you know, not a long career, but and a lot of Manny's men, as they swept over Parsons Ridge, commented. One guy said, "Well, I'll be damned, that's Jim Jackson, who he'd
yeah,
known before the war, and sort of stopped and was sad that he'd seen his body." So
yeah,
Yeah. I think you've got a blog post on
yep,
his own aftermath, right?
right.
So folks can look at that for some more details on the Western Theater blog. So absolutely. Well, my comment, I was on mute. We're just waiting for the rest of the Brigade by Brigade series for Perryville. So
That's right.
yeah, right. But
You
no,
wait a long time.
well, that's okay. Well, no, it's not. I'm the oldest here, so I'm sure that I gotta have it before I die. But in all seriousness, Perryville's another one of those stories, and we're starting to see this more and more, where we are getting what I call additional ink on Western theater battles.
Yeah.
And this is my running joke. There's a small, insignificant college town in South Central Pennsylvania that seems to have a book that comes out on it like every other day.
Yeah.
I think we're up to volume 4 of Horse Poop at Gettysburg. The culverts and wet weather drainages of Gettysburg is coming out, I think. So and it's great. It's an iconic place. It's the gateway drug if you're trying to get some
Yeah.
war. But you didn't really have a lot of those microhistories in Western theater, right? You had some battle books, but you didn't have these microhistories. And now we're starting to see that a little bit more. And even some tour guide books that are coming out. I really think about Chickamauga for most of that. You're starting to see a lot more because of groundbreaking. Dave Powell comes out with his 3 volume books, and you've got Dr. Robertson coming out. He's got volume 1 out of his campaign operational study. But then that's led to others who have delved in and started doing some smaller detail type work. So it's fantastic. But yeah, we're looking forward to the Brigade series at Perryville.
Well, some stuff did end up on the cutting room floor, and I'm trying to remember what the original book was about. But there's some stuff on the other flank, and I may do something with that at some point, in terms of the left flank. But I think Manny's story though just was so interesting, and in his career and just sort of what happened to him during the battle too. I mean, he was supposedly kicked by a horse, or as the shot and shell was flying through the air, and sort of didn't charge with his troops at one point because he was sort of knocked senseless. And then he was later charged with, being a coward, and supposedly fought a duel with a doctor named Nickel from Nashville who'd accused him of cowardice, and supposedly wounded Nickel. So, he took that charge very seriously afterwards. But he was an interesting character in his own right, and but again, all these, he had all these, like the Colonel of the 41st Georgia got killed. I think I wrote a blog post on that one too, as well at one point. So it's just, a lot of interesting stories that sort of come out of just looking at really a small slice of the battlefield. And there's so many human interest stories that come out, but you can also learn about the bigger battle and hopefully about Civil War combat in general through those types of command studies.
Yeah. Fantastic book, folks. It's another History Press book. So it's just another excellent title if you want to get more details on Perryville with a focus on Manny and Stuart. Yes, you absolutely capture the Union opposition very well. So it's definitely a complete story on both sides. So then you moved into. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm looking forward to the Bushrod Johnson's brigade at Perryville. It'd be a whole whopping 5 pages, probably.
Yeah, I know.
Well, come on, Yankee, Buckeye Quaker here. Come on now. It's funny though too. I mean, and sure, I'm sure that Stuart has had access to all these things, but Kurt Holman was kind enough to share with me a few years ago all of his electronic files that he had, and Manny's brigade's got just a ton of counts and whatnot in it.
Yeah,
and Johnson's does as well, which is interesting considering. Yeah, there's not a lot of movement going on with Bushrod Johnson's brigade, but again, there's some interesting stories of like blue on blue and things along those lines. So there's some interesting thing, and then he himself he's an interesting character as well.
Yes, I think Kirk Jenkins did that great regimental history of the 15th Kentucky. Who were, and there's a great book, the Third Ohio History. Forgotten who wrote that.
Beatty.
One. Colonel Beatty, John Beatty. Wrote essentially it's a memoir about the regiment, I guess, and sort of a history written by the colonel. And so both those accounts, I mean, I love Kirk Jenkins' book. That's a great one too. And the Perryville chapter is awesome. So
yeah, very good stuff. All right. Well, then you switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I think the 4th book is the Ohio Bell book.
Correct.
If I remember correctly. So how did you even get into this one? Because this is antebellum period for folks who don't know. It's right before the Civil War. So how did you get involved with that one?
So I was then working on a different book that ended up becoming my 5th book, which is about a duel that was fought in Kentucky in May of 1862 between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. And while I was researching that book, I was doing some, period newspaper research, just trying to find, some more, essentially just some more source material on antebellum violence and that sort of thing. And I came across this newspaper article. It was short. It was only a couple of paragraphs, and it said that, a man was dragged out of the Mississippi River dead, tied to a chair. And I thought, what the hell is this? I mean, this is sad. What is this story? And why was he tied to a chair and thrown in the river to drown? And as I started pulling on that, the story ended up being he was on a boat called the Ohio Bell, and the book's called Murder on the Ohio Bell. And he had boarded at Smithland, Kentucky, near Paducah, and was sort of a Mississippian who had this kind of highborn swagger and said to be a planter's son. And he ended up getting in an argument with the boat's clerk on board, I'd say the short version of the story, and ended up shooting and killing the clerk while the boat was out in the middle of the river. And, if you're planning on shooting someone, a boat where you cannot escape is, it's probably not a good idea to shoot someone on a boat where you can't run away. But he ran up to the top of the deck. The crew chased him down, beat him up. And they were planning on, throwing him overboard to drown him, essentially. And there was a famous actress named Matilda Heron on board who performed up and down the Ohio River and was sort of famous in her day. And it was said that she had invented the emotional school of acting. So she would make, audiences actually weep because of her performances at the time. And she did this sort of appeal to the crew and saved this man's life. So they tied him to a chair below deck. But again, that night, as the story unfolds, you find out that they pitched him overboard. So it's sort of the book's about these 2 murders on board the boat. One of this, Mississippian who kills the boat's clerk, but then the second one being the vigilante justice that plays out. But as I was researching it, I found this twist in the story that it turned out the Mississippian wasn't who he said he was. and then he was also on the run for a horrible crime that he'd perpetrated in Mississippi, and he was living under an assumed name. And so I sort of tracked down who he actually was and write about that and write about the other murders that he'd perpetrated in Mississippi. And
Wow.
the problem with doing this stuff is that after the book had come out, I got an email saying, "Oh, I'm descended from this family. Are you sure that this was really the murderer and this was his true name?" And I was like, "Yeah, it was that. It was him." And I never heard from him again. So, every now and then, if you accuse somebody of being a murderer, you might hear from their great 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 nephew or something. But that was a fun one to write. It's also a compact book, and I looked at kind of antebellum violence along the Ohio River, and it really becomes a history of the boat itself. And I told one person, it's the Ohio Belle is sort of a character in the book in a sense. And I talk about the history of the three different versions of the Ohio Belle, which included quite a bit of Civil War service. I mean, the boat ended up transporting Union soldiers to a town that the Union soldiers then burned in retaliation for guerrilla attacks. It was used as a hospital transport for a long time. It was captured by the Confederates and then recaptured, and really went through it in its own right. And then, ironically, after the war, it was sold. It was renamed the Alabama Belle, and ended up after the war was sort of ripped apart and sold for scrap. But the story of what happened to the crew and the captain in particular, a guy named John Sebastian, he ended up becoming a riverboat. He was so angry that his boat had been seized by the Confederates. He joined the Union military and was a pilot of a Union gunboat and ended up having his arm blown off while fighting the gunboat CSS Arkansas. And so his story is interesting too. And he ended up out in Kansas and became sort of a well regarded cattle dealer. So it's just digging into those people, like Matilda Heron, like Captain Sebastian, these other people was really a lot of fun. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a University Press of Kentucky book, and it came out 5-6 years ago. 5 years ago.
Yeah. Actually, came out in March of 2020, right when a little pandemic hit. So that's my pandemic book, I guess. It came out right then. So
should have changed it. Should have had the cover of a steamboat with a mask on.
Yeah, I know. That would have worked pretty well.
Millions of copies at that point.
I do. I mean, that's in terms of a cover. I love that cover. It's
cool.
When I opened up the email that had it, it just blew me away. And sort of looks like a woodcut of a steamboat sort of coming at you. And I just like the color, and I'm not a designer at all, but it just really hit me. I really love it. But again, I wrote that one as sort of a break. In a weird way, it was sort of a break from my other book. I just needed a break to work on something else, and just got transfixed by that story, which was a lot of fun.
Good stuff. Well, then we have book number 5, which was book number 4, but actually became book number 5.
And book number 3 was really book number 1.
Right, exactly. So there'll be a pop quiz at the end for our
That's right.
All those that actually pass, Stuart will sign and send a free copy.
I'll send you Mill Springs maps is what I'll send you.
Well, I know exactly where people can get that. So that's
right.
Excellent. That's excellent. So the last one it's actually, this is a duel. I've driven right by the location numerous times on my trip between Augusta, Kentucky and Maysville. There used to be an historical marker there. It's been down for the last couple of years. So I don't know if it's in a refurbish stage or what the case may be, but it's right there next to a cemetery right outside the very small river town of Dover, Kentucky. So tell us about Anatomy of a Duel.
Yeah, and this book essentially looks at the secession crisis and how violence in Kentucky evolved after the Civil War through the lens of this duel that was fought in May of 1862, as I mentioned before, between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. And the roots of the duel really lay with Union consolidation of power early in the war. In September of 1861, Union authorities are trying to gain control of Kentucky. And one way they did that was by, arresting pro-Confederate Kentuckians and sending them across the Ohio River to Union military prisons without hearings or trials. Henry Clay's son, James B. Clay, had been arrested at one point, managed to get bonded out, however, but even former Governor Charles S. Moorhead, who'd been governor of Kentucky, was arrested, was swept up in this, was sent to Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor and Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. And so you have all these prominent Kentuckians getting arrested. And essentially in October of 1862, Union General William Bull Nelson, who'd been in command at Camp Dick Robinson, was sent up to Maysville to create Camp Kenton, which became a Union recruiting ground, a lot like Camp Dick Robinson. And he was going to embark on a campaign to clear Confederates out of the Big Sandy Valley region of eastern Kentucky. And before he did that, he wanted to sort of protect his rear flank, essentially. And he ended up arresting about 7 men in Maysville, Kentucky, another great Ohio River town. And that included a former U.S. congressman named John Stanton, but it also included the former mayor of Maysville, who's named William T. Casto. And the idea of these arrests, it was essentially, you could view it like shock probation. They were trying to arrest these men, kind of scare the secession out of them, throw them in dank prison cells. And then, if they took the Union loyalty oath, they would then be released. Well, most of the men took the oath and were sent back home. Casto refused. Instead, he thought about revenge the whole time. And as soon as he got out of jail, he ended up challenging Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalf to a duel because Metcalf had been in charge of the Union troops who'd arrested all these men in Maysville. And so, Metcalf didn't know who he was. He didn't really remember Casto, specifically, but he was, Metcalf was the son of a Kentucky governor. He was sort of seen as a rough, like a very sort of rough-hewn guy. And there's a quote that says, this was a man with whom one should not trifle. Was a real tough customer. Casto, who had limited knowledge of firearms, ended up challenging Metcalf to duel. And Metcalf, even though sort of the code duello, the unwritten rules about dueling, said that he probably really didn't need to accept. Since Metcalf was an early Unionist, he said, I don't want to be browbeaten. If I don't accept this duel, other secessionists will line up to try to either shame me or kill me. So he accepted. And they ended up fighting that duel in May of 1862 at Dover, as you mentioned, on the banks of the Ohio River, using Colt revolving rifles at 60 yards. And the rifles were loaded with one shot. And, the men, they tried to keep the duel quiet because it was illegal. Casto would have lost his law license. Metcalf would have been court-martialed if they'd been caught. But a crowd of hundreds of people showed up to watch this duel. And basically, Casto, when they arrived on the field, Casto immediately began practicing with the rifle, and Metcalf lay down on the bank of the Ohio River and took a nap. So that gives you an idea of how calm he was about fighting this, duel against Casto. And at one point, he sort of got up and he picked up his rifle and he shot the handle off a pocket knife at 60 yards and then lay back down. So with a man who can shoot like that, it's probably no surprise as to who actually won the duel. But before it started, he said, I shall shoot him through the left breast pocket. And that's basically what he did. And when the duel actually took place and they did the call to fire, he ended up shooting Casto through the chest and killing him eventually. And, the duel to me is interesting for a lot of reasons. To me, in the book, I look at it, make the argument it's kind of a pivot point in Kentucky history where the code duello fell out of fashion and, gentlemen no longer dueled after the Civil War. Instead, they ended up, carrying concealed weapons and shooting each other on the street. So that sort of honor-bound touchiness remained, and that, refusal to take insult remained. But instead of doing a formal negotiated duel, these guys would just pull pistols and start shooting on the street. And so there are innumerable cases in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s of prominent Kentuckians sort of gunning one another down on the street. So I kind of examined the secession crisis around Maysville, how the duel sort of related to that, honor culture, what other duels took place in Kentucky around that time, including the Civil War, describe the duel, the actual Casto-Metcalf duel, and then sort of go into how violence evolved. And, that sort of violence is one of the many things that changed Kentucky's reputation. Prior to the Civil War, it's seen as, the erudite land of Henry Clay, sipping mint juleps and raising thoroughbred horses. But then after all this violence, after feuds across the state, and after the assassination of Governor William Goebel in 1900, it's seen as a really kind of a feudal backwater. So, all that violence, violence lasted in Kentucky well until, the 1920s, 1930s. I mean, you open up historic newspapers from that time period, 1870 to 1940, and, more often than not, you'll find several murders reported. So that was a really kind of interesting book. I hate to say a fun book because it was, it's a sad story in a lot of ways, but, I learned a lot. I've really come to see Metcalf as one of the most compelling figures to emerge from Civil War Kentucky, because you have this governor's son who is a was a slave owner, was a pro-slavery unionist, like as I mentioned before, most Kentuckians were. But he really takes this turn during the war, and a lot of it had to do with sort of dealing with Morgan's raids and probably the duel as well. He began to blame slaveholders and slavery for being the cause of the war, which of course was a very unpopular thing to say in Kentucky. So he blamed slavery for the cause of the war. He eventually turned to support the Emancipation Proclamation. He supported Abraham Lincoln in the 1864 election, and he supported the enlistment of African American Union troops. And so, all those things most Kentuckians were opposed to. And so after the war, he ended up moving to Cincinnati, essentially in exile away from his home, which was Carlisle County, Kentucky. So his story in that turn I found to be just really, really, really interesting, and found these letters he wrote that are just scathing to newspapers about, blaming slave owners for being the cause of the war, and talking about how, I talk about this in the book, to be completely blunt, that when you look in their fields, you can tell that they're the ones fathering slave children, essentially. And, they claim a moral high ground and, claim that slavery is ordained by God, but, this is what they're doing in the dark of night is, raping these enslaved women. And, to have a unionist Kentuckian, former Union officer, write these things was just, extremely controversial at the time.
Mm-hmm. And he's a rough-hewn character, there's no doubt about it. And listeners will recognize his name from the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky.
Yeah.
He's a colonel of the 7th Kentucky Cav. Unfortunately, breaks and runs at Big Hill, and then kind of breaks and runs a little bit again the day before the battle.
His men don't really match
him.
Yeah. Him and then he quits, and then he leaves. He's so angry, he leaves the Union Army. And then that book too, one thing that really struck me, and I didn't realize this going into it, but all these guys who were involved with the duel, even on the periphery, like their seconds or people who negotiated, ended up, having these violent street encounters of their own. And that to me was just, and the men who had been arrested with Casto, several of those men were involved in violence, or their kids were. And, it just shows how violence really permeated Kentucky society at that point. One, for example, talk about another center college grad, but Thomas Marshall Green started as the primary negotiator for Casto, and he was a newspaper editor. He'd been a lawyer, but he had sort of done a challenge to duel, and so he lost his law license. But he had been kind of this negotiator for Metcalf. But after the war, in about 1887, he was a journalist and had accused a Nicholasville politician of essentially voter fraud. And a bunch of poll books had gone missing, and he blamed this guy named Lou Baldwin. And on the day that the John C. Breckinridge statue was dedicated in downtown Lexington, these two guys ran into one another on the street, cursed at each other, and pulled pistols, and around a crowd of hundreds of people outside the Phoenix Hotel began shooting. And Green ended up killing Baldwin in that fight, and wounded a bystander as well. So you have all these guys who are involved in the Casto Metcalf duel, sort of engaging in their own affairs of honor, even though they weren't sort of formal fights.
It's interesting, with how dueling was such a big thing, like what you said, that when people are sworn into Kentucky state office, there is a big part of that oath of office that says, they've never participated in a duel, nor have they been a second. And because when I take my kids to this conference called KYA, Kentucky Youth Assembly, it's like a mock state government. And so, they do elections for governor for next year and everything. And some student gets elected, and they do the oath of office in front of, the entire conference. And the kids, like when they start that oath of office, and it starts going into this, like the vast majority of this oath of office is about dueling. So if you're not from Kentucky, or if you are, you've never heard of it, you just Google this thing. But the kids start looking at each other like, we're still talking about dueling?
Yeah, like, and they still, it was put in the 1850 Constitution as a way. They hope that, an upper class Kentuckian's sort of political ambition, they hope that political ambition would kind of override the need to duel. Of course, that didn't happen a lot in Kentucky, but a lot of these guys, even though they took that oath, ended up did fight duels. And one of there were anti-dueling societies that formed. One of my favorite documents I found, I think this was at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, but it was this petition of all these men signing, an anti-dueling pledge. And they all signed, except at the very bottom, there's this one guy says, "I will not duel except under very extreme circumstances." and so, they still, even though they had oaths and things like that, again, as you mentioned, it's still used today, which I'm really thankful for. I think it's a great part of Kentucky history. But
It is, yeah.
it didn't really affect these guys from dueling, because that call of honor and the need to avoid sort of the public embarrassment and shame of not fighting when someone called you out just outweighed any desire for political office. And again, you had men like Henry Clay fought 2 duels. In 1809 he fought a duel when he was in the legislature. About 10 years later, when he was Secretary of State, he fought a senator from Virginia in a duel. He was actually injured once in that first duel, slightly injured. So it's just when you have men like Henry Clay fighting these duels, it sort of puts this, almost societal stamp of approval on the practice. And so then other upper class Kentuckians are like, yeah, that's perfect. I'll duel too. And so it goes on and on. So that was a, again, I hate to say fun book to research, but I just, found it really, really fascinating.
Oh yeah. And I thought it was pretty neat too, that just how widespread this duel was known.
Yeah.
Even down in the South, it's, after the Battle of Richmond, when these reports are coming in, the Confederate officers writing the reports are saying, I think they called Metcalf like the murderer Metcalf.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how they talk about
the slayer of Casto and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And,
and it's like, man, that made it into the official records.
Yeah, it's crazy. And, it was one of several duels fought during the Civil War. I mentioned Manny had fought after Perryville. And then you had, in Little Rock in 1863, you had, John Marmaduke fighting Lucius Walker. I think those are their first names. Get a little rusty. They fought, at 15 paces or 45 feet with Colt Navy revolvers, and Marmaduke ended up killing Walker and, never faced court-martial. They just sort of like, yeah, it's, we all get why this happened, and he went back to command. So, again, among among men of that time, it was just sort of they understood that sort of need to protect your reputation above everything else, and so these guys would end up fighting these duels. So
yeah,
it continues on, of course, which I think you touch on in the book. One that I talk about on tours down at Cynthiana, Kentucky.
Oh yeah,
is the Deshay Kimbrough duel.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a fascinating story too. That takes place in 1866, if I remember correctly.
Right.
I love telling that story when oftentimes I'll end my tour at the cemetery.
Yeah.
And that's where I'll bring it, because those 2 men are buried in the same cemetery.
Yep.
So
yeah,
it's kind of cool. I won't give away the full story there, and I won't cuss because we have to bleep it out. But
one cool part, I keep saying cool, but one part about that I find fascinating is that the dueling ground, there were several duels fought where those 2 guys ended up fighting, and it's currently part of the Kentucky Horse Park, or next to the Horse Park. And the reason it was fought there, because it was on the Fayette County, Scott County, Kentucky line. It was on the farm of James K. Duke, who I think was the uncle of Basil Duke, John Hunt Morgan's sort of second in command and brother-in-law. There was a duel in 1852 there where 2 Transylvania University students ended up fighting a duel using shotguns loaded with slugs at this terribly close range. And like one literally blew the head off the other one. Earlier, there were 2 doctors who fought a duel there. They'd had an argument over a post-mortem examination, and one of the doctors shot the other in the femoral artery. And as the wounded doctor was bleeding to death, his opponent steps up and says, "May I help him?" And they're like, "Sure." And he ended up saving, the life of the man he just shot. And that's called the Dudley Richardson duel. And, again, I mean, to me, like every duel you could probably spin a book off of, because they're all insane. Roger Hanson, who was later killed while leading the Orphan Brigade at Stones River. He had fought a dual. I never say it right. Vivi, Indiana, or VV, Indiana. VV.
Today they call it VV.
VV, Indiana. Okay.
It's Swiss, but VV is how they call it.
So. Yeah. So he fought at VV, and because he had insulted a man who was going to marry his cousin, and the man ended up challenging him to a duel, shot him in the leg, and so Hanson walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and earned the nickname Old Bench Leg, because of that duel. So. Not the type of nickname you want to have, Old Bench Leg. So
no.
It really is wild how many of these men did have a history of some sort of dueling. Like Albert Sidney Johnston, down in Texas was in a duel, and then Abraham Lincoln's near duel,
right, with broadswords. Yeah, great story. Well, and I mentioned James S. Jackson. I mean, he was a second. I think he was Albert Sidney Johnston's second in a duel in Mexico, maybe. I mean, so you have. And one thing I talk about in the book too is how Kentuckians sort of exported their own, kind of brand of honor culture into Missouri and then farther west too. And so you got all these, Kentucky-born Missourians who ended up fighting duels in the Show Me State too. And then, when the gold rush is happening, you have these Southerners who are dueling in California in the 1850s as well. And, wherever it seems like wherever Kentuckians went, dueling sort of followed. And it's just really fascinating. And I think, again, that evolution of violence in Kentucky too is just, a really sad, dark chapter in our history, but one that I think just spins off so many interesting stories about what the culture was like at the time.
Yeah.
So was there a reason why sometimes there would be duels and then other times they would just like pull a pistol and shoot somebody or just beat them? Like why sometimes would they duel and then other times they would?
That's a great question. Yeah. So sort of the code of honor at the time, honor was sort of like, how did society view you, but also how did you view yourself? And, historians have sort of said, the thing that, upper class white Southerners wanted to avoid shame more than anything else. And again, that loss of reputation, they wanted to protect their reputation at all costs, but there are these, differences in class, of course, in the antebellum South. And so if you were an upper class Kentuckian, and if someone from your same social class insulted you, you would challenge them to a duel. But if someone from a lower social class insulted you, you had to deal with that affront immediately. And so you would horsewhip them, cane them, beat them on the street, that sort of thing. So, a minute ago, we talked about my Murder on the Ohio Bell book, and the way that murder got sparked is because this sort of quote unquote lower class clerk ended up manhandling the Mississippi planter's son out of the cabin. He'd been drunk and had tried to pass counterfeit money, and the clerk said, "This is not real money." And the guy got mad and was cursing in front of the ladies, So this clerk grabs him and hustles him out of the deck. And, to put your hands on an upper class Southerner, he's like, I've got to deal with this insult immediately. So he just pulled a pistol and shot the clerk and killed him. And another thing, one reason you would horsewhip a man of the lower class is you're sort of equating him with slaves and enslaved people at that time too. So the differences in violence tended to rely on what class you were and what class was the person who had insulted you.
It kind of reminds me of the Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner beating. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to just think back. Brooks initially was going to challenge him to a duel, right? And then someone told him, no, just beat him.
Yeah, and I think because his cousin had been insulted too, and so he's like sort of holding up that family honor. And I think seeing him as a Yankee too, I think had a lot to do with that, not dueling. But there's a great book. Oh gosh, of course I just forgot, but it's about violence in Congress. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
I went blank, of course, on the author and the title.
Is it Joanne Freeman?
Thanks, Joan Freeman. Yeah, and she wrote a killer book on dueling in general that I actually like better than her Field of Blood, which is the congressional violence book, which is great. But her dueling book is awesome too, and her research is just really wonderful and talking about kind of honor because again, where Kentuckians went, they dueled, and there was the Congressman William Graves from Kentucky. I think it was William, ended up fighting a duel with a congressman from Maine. His last name was Silly, Cilley, and they used rifles, and Graves killed Silly. And it was just, a huge controversy, as one can imagine. And, they ended up, it just became this massive controversy about, violence in general. And, a lot of anti-dueling legislation sprang up around the country and that sort of thing. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic. I feel like, especially here in Kentucky, and then just really around the whole country during that time period too.
Yeah, and people think of it more as like a deep South thing too, a lot of times, and the fact it was happening in Kentucky and Missouri, as well. I think is pretty interesting.
It definitely permeates north of the Ohio River too, because I wrote about 4 gentlemen in the Mexican-American War in the 1st Ohio Infantry Regiment. But where they grew up or where they were located are the counties that border Kentucky on the northern side of the river. Ironically, all 4 of those men become colonels of different Ohio regiments during the Civil War. One we know of more famously is Ferdinand Vanderveer, leads a brigade later on at Chickamauga. He's present at Perryville. That brigade doesn't really, James Stedman's brigade doesn't really do a whole lot at Perryville, but it's interesting. I feel like those gentlemen from Claremont and Brown counties are really Southerners. That's what they really, truly are. So I can definitely see that. Of course, this is 1847, I think is when that duel took place. And I think it was more of an honor duel. Nobody really knows the details. I think they probably fired their pistols upright, like straight up in the air.
Yeah.
It was just something very silly. But that honor, that code, like you impugned my honor for whatever reason, was very strong even with those gentlemen.
Yeah, and a lot of times men got pushed to the dueling ground by their peers, and the object wasn't always to kill your opponent. I mean, duels would end. You could end it after the first fire if they felt like honor had been satisfied. Andrew Jackson fought a guy named Dickinson who'd insulted his wife down, the Tennessee-Kentucky border.
I love that.
In Simpson County, Kentucky, and the negotiations for that duel took like 6 months. And so, some historians have posited the two guys really didn't want to duel. Like Jackson, they got sort of pushed to it. People kept sort of encouraging them to do it. But one of my favorite stories is that, after there were two duelists, they'd exchanged fire. And the seconds, who were sort of the negotiators and the helpers, their friends who helped them with the duel, said, well, maybe they should shake hands. And the other second said, well, their hands have been shaking for the last 30 minutes. They're so terrified, and so while they were pointing their pistols at one another, their hands were just shaking violently. And so the duel ended after that. Because again, terrifying experience. But, if one person got wounded, the whole idea of duels were supposed to be kept dispassionate and they're supposed to be kept fair. And so if one person was wounded, the duel would stop because it was seen as being unfair to, duel a wounded man. So there were these kind of unwritten rules of behavior that took place. And a lot of weapons that were used. I mean, pistols at, 30 feet, 10 paces was sort of the typical. But again, as I mentioned, the challenged party got to choose the weapons. And sometimes it was swords, sometimes it was rifles, sometimes it was pistols.
So what else is in the works like that you can share? Of course.
Too many. I mean, as you can tell, like me jumping around from topic to topic, I've got, it's just sort of depressing. Like too many different book titles started. Not too many Civil War actually. Like one thing I'm working on now is kind of a story about Prohibition era political corruption in Kentucky, in Western Kentucky, and that's one that I've kind of been sinking my teeth into, and sort of found that accidentally. Long story short, I was like, I may write a piece on sort of, violence from 100 years ago, like an op-ed piece or a blog post or something. So I started nosing through 1925 newspapers and found a story about a murder, and then started researching that, and then found out that it tells it's a start toward a bigger story about political corruption in Western Kentucky. So that's one I've kind of been, picking out a little bit, but I keep jumping back and forth between other things as I too often do.
I have that same problem.
Yeah. The problem is then you don't get anything done.
It's like, oh, this is fun. And then I'm like, oh, that looks really cool.
Yeah. It's like the duel book, I had to force myself. I was like, you've got to finish this one, and kind of knuckled down and got it done. But, I need to do that with about 10 other projects, unfortunately. So.
Well, I think I've had this conversation with Derrick before. I probably have 8 or 10 books right now on the nightstand. So I bounce around just from topic from, let's see, I got Wake Island to I'm working on a review for Emerging Civil War on an Albert Sidney Johnston book.
Oh, cool.
It's just all over the place, right?
The Iron Dice, the battle one? Is that, or the Iron?
No, this is a newer book that came out this year, as a matter of fact. And it's kind of, I'm only 3 chapters. I just literally got it like in the mail 3 days ago. I'm like 3 or 4 chapters in, but it's kind of counter to Tim Smith's book, which is interesting. He's trying to go a long way to dispel some of the Albert Sidney Johnston issues that a lot of us talk about, like, never visited Fort Donelson, never commanded large armies, etc. But he's going through right now is kind of breaking down all the challenges he has, from political, geographical challenges that were going on, of course, just arming the troops in late 1861.
Yeah.
So he's kind of breaking that down. He's very well written. So we'll get that review together. And you'll see that on Emerging Civil War. But it's a pretty good book. It's published in Western Australia. And so it's really, I don't know if the gentleman just couldn't find an American publisher, but it's interesting because you'll be going through, and it'll say something like, "Oh, this is about 100 miles," and then in parentheses, 62 kilometers. Like, it's
Oh, that's funny.
hilarious.
That's
So
the
they put all the
world-renowned
measurements.
historian there. He's like, coming from
Yeah,
Australia to
yeah.
It's,
So
like talking about Mill Springs. I mean, it gives you an appreciation of how difficult it was early in the war with these men who didn't have experience to deal with logistics, to deal with troop movements, especially a place like Mill Springs where it was foggy and rainy and the weather was terrible. But I have a lot more sympathy for sort of these early war commanders trying to do impossible feats essentially at the time.
Yeah, no one was very good at their like. Very few people were good at their job during that
Right,
time period. I
right.
feel like.
But again, that's
absolutely.
where you have George Thomas when he finally arrived on the battlefield. Just sort of takes the reins and just crushes it. And so you do see
Yeah.
these glimpses of greatness, military greatness, in these battles, or in these early battles, from some of these commanders who end up reaching great heights. Really, Speed Fry, the Fourth Kentucky, again, that colonel, even though his men held the line for a long time, he never really didn't do much. I mean, he ended up commanding Camp Nelson and issuing that terrible refugee order, expulsion order, things like that. But from a military standpoint, just didn't rise to the top like someone like Thomas did. So.
Right, absolutely. I like how you said that when Thomas finally arrives on the field.
Yeah, he was a little late, but
yeah, a little late.
He arrived at the right time.
Also indicative of future performance.
That's
so.
Right. That's what I never thought about it. So yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Derrick, what else do you have for Stuart this evening?
Oh, I just love the conversation. It's talking about Perryville a little bit, talking about duels and steamboat murders. It's been great.
Well, and I do want to say I appreciate the work you guys have done in terms of the whole Western Theater blog, the tours, the book reviews, and all, and just sort of in the podcast as well. Just sharing all this great history to such a broad number of people. I mean, I think you guys have really struck gold at the right time in terms of your platforms. I think it's just really interesting, and the tours have all been wonderful, and I don't know, just really well organized and a lot of fun. And when you go to these, you get a good sense of camaraderie with the other people who are attending too, and that's really the most fun part of it, meeting these people who are interested in these same topics we all are. And I appreciate you guys providing a platform to do all that, and really commend you for all. It's hard work. I know it's hard work, and the fact you're bringing great recognition to these important sites too. I mean, you all have helped Perryville a lot, have helped the Friends of Perryville, and you have all these important battlefields across, again, the Western Theater that sometimes don't get the credit they deserve. So I appreciate you guys kind of opening the transom and letting a little more light in on what transpired out in this end of the country. So thanks to you guys for doing all that.
Nice. All right, I'm going to clip that and put it at the front of every single episode from here on out.
And then our check in the mail, Stuart. Thank you very much.
Well, how about, what are you guys working on? I mean, I'm sure people never get to hear from hosts as much. So what are the next projects coming up? If I can turn the table on you for a minute.
Well, the one I was typing a little bit in right before I sent y'all the link tonight. I'm working on the 1861-62 situation here in Kentucky.
Cool.
But going over into southern Illinois and that little bitty part of Missouri there too. Pretty much just looking at all that as one big, not event, but one big section. Because the way I've learned about this whole thing was in different books.
Yeah.
Either they're focusing only on the Army of the Ohio or only on the Army of Tennessee. You don't get both of them, seeing how they're actually interacting together. Especially in the Western Kentucky area, there is a line there where you've got this side's area and this. There's a lot of overlap going on too.
Yeah.
And then the Confederates, how from their point of view too. So there's a lot of really cool stories that I've been looking up, and all these little rabbit holes too.
Yeah.
It's like I'll be going through these newspapers like, oh, what's that? And then I start diving into that, and it's this other big thing connects to other things.
Never ending. So are you focusing on Western Kentucky again, like a certain number of counties, or what's your scope?
Yeah. So right now, that's kind of what my focus. Eventually, I'd love to go from Appalachian Mountains all the way over to, just the entire department there, really.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking about is, how do I tie it all in? Do I do it chronologically? Do I do it by area? So it's kind of not for sure how to really put together. I've got all these different things written out.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, where do I put it in the document kind of thing? But I'm only like 45, 50 pages in to it right now. Still doing a lot of research on it and everything, but doing that, and then also like like you said, I keep getting pulled back into 64, 65 gorilla
Yeah.
stuff. That always keeps pulling me back in too. So that really got me back in into that. And I guess it's back in January probably. We had a snow day for school, and so we had one of those NTI days. And once we got out, I just pulled up the newspaper thing and I started just searching in there, and I found this story about a Kentucky cavalry regiment that goes into Illinois hunt for Confederate guerrillas, and when they find them, they just kill them. I mean, there is no trial. It is capture, execute, bury them, and then they go back to Kentucky. And it was like, that is something you don't hear about very often, is Kentucky cavalry going into Illinois to look for Confederate guerrillas, or supposedly Confederate guerrillas. But it was that kind of thing. Maybe the more I thought about that and the more I dug into it, it was like, man, this sort of thing's going on all over the place. And
and that's every community in Kentucky was affected by the war.
Yeah,
I think you have a lot of people assume, oh, there's a battle at Perryville, there's a battle at Mill Springs, there's a fight at Paducah, and there were these smaller fights, but thanks to guerrilla war and that terrible violence, I mean, every community suffered in one way or the other. And
then you've got like Lions Raid going on at the same time. It's so there's a lot of there's just so many moving pieces. And like I said, people focus on the big battles,
right?
But I mean, the war is very much in the backyards of a lot of people. The armies are 100 miles away, but the war is very much still right in their faces. And that's kind of what I just love, getting into that kind of stuff.
That's great.
So, but that's me. So, Darryl,
well, first, as Stuart, thank you very much for those kind words. Derrick started it all off, so we make sure we have that straight right out of the gate, right?
Couldn't have done it myself.
Fun. You talked about the camaraderie. It's really neat. I've been doing this thing down at Chickamauga. I go to a symposium down there every year, and I've been able to meet some really cool people every year down there. And I have done now side tours with these same people, and some of these folks will still show up now to like the Perryville things or the Richmond things that we've done in the past. And so, yes, it's kind of like a reunion, right? We have our eating bull sessions where we're popping open beers, glasses of wine, and spewing even more invective about the war. We try to stay away from modern politics, as Nick and I agree. But so that's very kind. But
you should be drinking bourbon, Darryl, and not beer or wine.
I can't, Stuart, you're gonna hate. You guys are just gonna throw me off this right now. I try to drink bourbon. I hate it.
We're gonna stop this interview right now. It's over.
As much as I am in Kentucky, I want to enjoy bourbon. I cannot drink it. When I was a younger man, me and Mr. Beam had an argument, and Mr. Beam won.
Yeah, I've lost many in my 20s. Lost many of those arguments, unfortunately.
Yeah, I might have been mixing Beam with eggnog made from pure grain and Bush beer. I won't confirm.
I get you.
It was bad, and so even the smell today is just.
No, I'm with you.
And I want to it just looks so cool on all these tours, but. No, I can't do it. I have the squirrel effect, so I don't think I'm ever going to write a book. I just not like a full blown whatever. I just cannot seem to stay that focused that long. So that's why the blogging works for me. I've got a ton of drafts for the Western Theater. I just need to sit down and crank those out. But I am working on a couple like those short things I do, those self-published things. One is a modern history on the 86th Ohio.
Oh, cool.
6-month version. They were organized right at the beginning of Morgan's not so great raid. So they're involved with repelling him or, Is
that John Hunt Morgan you're referring to?
No. I almost interrupted you before, but I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of making a mistake. So, it's going to be called John Don't Call Me Hunt Morgan and the Not So Great Raid of 1863. Anyway,
but the thing to remember, I mean, books don't have to be long, and I think people are, the general public. I don't know if it's thanks to social media or what, but our attention spans are just getting worse anyway. So I'd encourage you. 100-page book is still a book, and I think you've got a knowledge base that is valuable and would teach people something. I'd encourage you to get started. And Darren may agree with me on this. I don't know, but the first book's sort of the hardest. And once you get that done and get it under your belt, then you go, oh, this wasn't as
You learn a lot.
bad. And,
Yes.
then you're kind of, it just builds your confidence to do the second one too. So
yeah, I've got this other thing. It's been in progress for 5 years now or 4 years now, and it's Basil Duke operating in northern Kentucky in 1862. So it's a snow pond skirmish, falling back to Falmouth, and then the fight at Augusta.
That Augusta stuff's crazy. I'd written a long piece on that. Never did anything with it a long time ago, and it's fascinating to me.
So I've really worked on that and
cool.
Set that down, but I still I haven't even started writing the actual Battle of Augusta piece yet. Like I've been so focused on, narrowing down the casualties and that sort of thing. And so I probably have I hope I have the most accurate list of casualties sides that I can find. Unfortunately, you don't really get a whole lot of home guard records. I did have help from our fine friends there in Frankfurt a little bit, but they didn't have a home guard roster for the actual home guard in Augusta. But regardless, so there's that, but just little things. I kind of like doing those little things and running across, little diaries. If I do a book, it's probably going to be that Basil Duke in Northern Kentucky.
That'd be awesome. That'd be great.
So, I figured I'll put John H. Morgan on the front of it or something, even if it has nothing to do with it, just to sell some copies, right?
Basil Duke, another Center College graduate.
Yeah, you go. Right?
They're popping up everywhere, but
that's right. The brains of Mr. Morgan. Let's just make sure we have that straight.
Yeah, there's that line of if you hit Morgan in the head, Basil Duke's brain would pop out. I wish I knew who came up with that, but
I use it. I don't know who had it, but I use it. So,
that's
about it. So there's that piece. Just working on things like that. Otherwise, we're working on the Perryville Symposium for October. And then I've had some conversations with Andrew Miller down at Mill Springs about maybe trying to put together a Western Theater Civil War symposium down there.
Oh, great.
So you may be getting a call from us, just FYI.
That'd be fun. Be a lot of fun.
A mixture of speakers and tours. Because as you said, the core battlefield there, you literally can stand on Last Stand Hill and see a huge portion of it.
Right.
So just probably 2 kind of smaller tours and maybe a couple or 3 speakers and that sort of thing, but very preliminary. But that's I love the organizing those kinds of things, right? That's kind of what I enjoy doing. Of course, there'll be beer involved because we'll hit a local brewery for a debrief or something. But
like Braxton Bragg, you focus on logistics is what I'm hearing here, Darryl.
That's right. And I always have options. Well, Mr. Bragg didn't, but I always have options too. My hiking friends would tell you that. It's like, well, if we go down this trail, we can be at the brewery in 3 hours, but if we keep going, we won't get there until 5 hours from now, right? So always have options. So but that's stuff I'm working on. So
cool.
But appreciate it. Thank you very much for those kind words about
definitely.
the effort. We do it for fun. I mean, it's obviously labor of love, right? It's great. We've been fortunate with the podcast and fortunate with blog posts and just the support of people in general. It's cool. We hope to have an even larger turnout for Perryville this year. I think we've gotten up to about 50 or 55 attendees now.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd like to get that even more.
And not to lay it on too thick, but even, the fact that you've got some young people coming, some college age people is just a really good, sign.
Well,
working.
That's the Taylor Bishop fan club.
Yeah,
right?
I know. We don't want to pump his ego up too much, but but having people like Taylor and others show up, and and also the fact that Camp Nelson, for example, hires a lot of younger people too, is just a great, really a great boon for Kentucky in terms of training that next generation of people who are interested, not only in the history, but also in preservation and, lighting a fire under them for these stories and these places is incredibly important too. So,
we're so fortunate. Again, I live in Ohio, but I call Kentucky kind of my playground for Civil War,
right.
And we're very fortunate to have passionate people at Camp Nelson and also at Mill Springs.
Oh yeah,
really bring those more to the fore.
Yep.
What's happened in Camp Nelson just in the last 2 or 3 years has just been fantastic, right?
And also,
but you can tell the staff wants to make that great.
And I think if you talk to Ernie and Steve there, they would give a definite hat tip to the locals who spent the sort of 20 years setting it up too. And so I do want to give a hat tip to, same with Mill Springs. Like I mentioned Bill Nykirk a couple of times with the Mill Springs Battlefield Association. You could do another podcast episode on, Civil War preservation in Kentucky, because
Yeah.
so much great success has happened here. Perryville is a national model for historic preservation, going from 98 acres to 1,300. I have two national monuments, Mill Springs and Camp Nelson, close to one another. Richmond Battlefield, Tebbs Bend. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So we should be really proud of, these partnerships that emerge between federal, state, governments and private individuals to really make this stuff happen. It's pretty incredible. So.
Yeah, it's very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, on that, we've done our over an hour again.
Yeah. I didn't.
We always said hour and 20 minutes. Well, we're doing all right. This one blew by. That was pretty good.
I know, it's been fun. I appreciate you guys having me.
Absolutely. Derrick,
we'll definitely do it again. Oh yeah. Yeah. Next time, we get the next book ready, we'll definitely be on to talk about that again. So, and I'd like to just do another deep dive on the aftermath of Perryville. I mean, that would be fun. Yeah,
that'd be very cool. Not everybody can come and hear Stuart talk at a round table or on the porch at the bottom house. So it'd be great just to kind of have that available as a podcast. So thanks for doing this, Stuart.
No, really anytime. And again, thanks for all you guys are doing. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up. Thank you all for listening. And just as a reminder, visit us at westerntheatercivilwar.com and like and share and subscribe. Do whatever it is you got to do to help get the word out. And we appreciate it as always. So we hope everyone has a great night.
Good evening, folks.